There are moments in a man's life when time doesn't move forward. It just stops. You don't hear a sound when it happens. No warning. No countdown. 1 second you're still telling yourself you're holding things together, and the next, you realize the ground you've been standing on has quietly given way. That morning, I sat in a plastic chair that felt too small, knees angled awkwardly, hands folded like I was waiting for a verdict instead of a signature. The room smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, the kind of place where emotion is processed into paperwork and pain is translated into neat, professional language. Words floated past me: division of assets, final settlement, no further claims. Clean words. Precise words. Words that never once touched the truth of what was happening. Because what ended in that room wasn't just a marriage. It was the version of myself I'd been living inside for years. I held the pen longer than I needed to. It was heavier than it looked, the kind you only see in places where decisions can't be undone. I expected my hand to shake. I expected something dramatic: anger, panic, regret clawing its way out of my chest. But nothing came. Just a quiet numbness, like the moment after a car accident when everything goes silent and your mind hasn't caught up to the damage yet. I signed. Across the table, she watched me carefully. Prepared. Like this was a meeting she'd rehearsed for. Her posture was straight, her expression neutral, the same look she used to have when she'd already made up her mind and was waiting for me to fall in line. When I slid the papers back, her eyes lifted for just a second. Long enough to see if I would hesitate. Long enough to check if there was still something left in me worth fighting over. There wasn't. That was the moment she knew she'd won. "You'll be okay," she said quietly. Not cruel. Not kind either. Just distant. "You always figure things out." I nodded without thinking. Muscle memory. Years of conditioning kicking in before emotion had a chance. That sentence had followed me my entire adult life. Bosses said it when workloads piled up. Friends said it when I didn't complain. Family said it when I avoided asking for help. "You'll be fine. You're strong. You adapt." No one ever asked if I wanted to keep adapting. No one ever asked what it cost to always be the man who could take one more hit and keep standing. The judge said something final. Chairs scraped back. Folders closed. People stood up and moved on with their day. And just like that, 6 years of marriage were reduced to neat stacks of paper and polite eye contact. Outside, the air felt sharper, like it was daring me to react. I stood on the courthouse steps longer than I needed to, watching strangers pass by with coffee cups and phone calls and lives that were still intact. No one looked at me twice. No one could tell that I no longer had a home to return to, that the keys in my pocket were about to unlock nothing. I checked my phone out of habit. No messages. No missed calls. That's when the truth finally landed. She didn't just take the house. She didn't just take the furniture, the shared savings, the framed photos she said she'd organize later. She took the version of me that knew exactly where he belonged. For years, my life had been built around being dependable, stable, predictable. I chose safety over ambition, compromise over desire. I told myself that's what being a good husband meant, that wanting more was immature, selfish, dangerous. Every time I felt restless, I pushed it down. Every time I thought about doing something different, something bigger, I reminded myself of responsibilities, of expectations, of the quiet approval I got for being reliable. I buried parts of myself so deeply that I forgot they were ever there. Standing there alone, that realization hit harder than the divorce itself. Without her, I didn't actually know who I was supposed to be. A memory surfaced without asking permission. Late nights from years ago. A laptop glowing in a dark room. Pages filled with ideas I never followed through on. Plans I never shared because I was afraid of how they'd sound out loud. A version of me that wanted more than comfort, more than stability, more than being the safe choice. I remembered the night I closed that laptop. Told myself it was just a phase. That adulthood meant sacrifice. That love meant letting go of certain dreams. I never opened it again. For a long time, I convinced myself that choice was noble, responsible, necessary. But standing there, divorced and hollowed out, I wondered if it had really been fear all along. Fear of failing. Fear of being judged. Fear of choosing myself and discovering I wasn't as capable as everyone thought. I walked to my car and sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. The engine was off, but the world kept moving anyway. For the first time in years, there was no plan waiting for me. No role to step back into. No one expecting me to come home and be a version of myself that fit neatly into their life. Just me. And the uncomfortable realization that I had spent most of my adulthood building a life that looked solid from the outside, but felt borrowed on the inside. A question surfaced, slow and unavoidable. If everything is gone, what's actually left? I didn't have an answer yet, but I could feel the question settling into me, heavy and persistent. I knew it would follow me into empty rooms, into sleepless nights, into every awkward conversation that came next. Because losing the marriage wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I could no longer avoid the one thing I'd been running from my entire adult life. Myself. The first thing I noticed after the divorce wasn't the silence. It was the lack of shape. Marriage gives your life edges. Morning routines. Expectations. Someone else's schedule pulling you forward even when you don't feel like moving. I didn't realize how much of my structure came from that until it was gone. I woke up the first Monday alone in a room that didn't feel like mine. The ceiling fan hummed softly above me, uneven, like it had a limp. The mattress was thinner than I was used to. The walls were bare except for a faint scuff mark that looked like it had been there long before me, and would still be there long after I left. For a few seconds, I didn't remember where I was. Then it came back all at once. The divorce. The signatures. The keys I no longer carried. I sat up slowly, waiting for something to happen inside me. Panic. Anger. Motivation. Something. But all I felt was a dull heaviness, like my body had woken up before my sense of purpose did. This was temporary, I told myself. Just a phase. A reset. But even as the thought formed, it felt thin. I showered, dressed, and stared at my reflection longer than necessary. Same face. Same tired eyes. But there was something missing. Not confidence exactly, direction. The quiet certainty that came from knowing why you were doing what you were doing. I drove to work on autopilot. Same roads. Same traffic lights. Same radio station I hadn't changed in years. Everything looked familiar, but none of it felt anchored anymore. Like I was watching my own life through glass. At the office, no one said anything directly. They never do. But I could feel it. The slight hesitation before conversations. The way meetings moved on without me being pulled in. The glances that lingered just long enough to register concern, or worse, relief. I used to be reliable. The guy who stayed late without being asked. The one who didn't complain when things got heavy. That reputation doesn't disappear overnight. But it does erode. By mid-morning, my inbox was full and my head was empty. I reread the same email 3 times without absorbing a word. Numbers blurred. Deadlines felt abstract, like they belonged to someone else. At lunch, I stayed at my desk. Not because I was busy, but because I didn't want to explain myself. Didn't want to answer questions I didn't know how to respond to. How are you holding up? Fine. You settling in okay? Yeah. Lies so practiced they didn't even feel like lies anymore. Later that afternoon, my manager stopped by. He leaned against the doorframe instead of sitting down, like he didn't plan on staying long. I need you present, he said. Not just physically. I nodded again. Same reflex as the courthouse. Same automatic compliance. I know things are keep changing for you, he continued. But the work still needs to be solid. I wanted to tell him I was trying. That every ounce of focus I had left was being spent just holding myself together. But I didn't. I thanked him for the feedback and promised it wouldn't happen again. He left looking unconvinced. That night, I returned to the room that wasn't mine. The overhead light flickered when I turned it on. I stood there, briefcase still in my hand, unsure what to do next. There was no dinner waiting. No conversation to catch up on. No shared silence on the couch that somehow made the day feel complete. I ate something quick. Tasteless. Functional. My phone buzzed on the table. My father's name lit up the screen. I watched it ring. I knew what the voicemail would sound like before he left it. Careful. Measured. Concern wrapped in restraint. I didn't want to hear it. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to explain what was happening to me without sounding weak. Without admitting that I didn't have a plan. So I let it go unanswered. Later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the hum of the fan. My mind replayed the same questions on a loop. Was I ever respected, or just useful? Did people value me for who I was, or for how much I carried without dropping? For the first time, the idea crept in quietly. Maybe the structure I'd lost wasn't taken from me. Maybe I'd never built one of my own. The thought didn't explode. It settled. Heavy. Uncomfortable. As sleep finally pulled me under, one thing became clear. If I didn't find a way to define my days again, on my terms, someone else would. And I wasn't sure I could survive another life built by default. I didn't find it on purpose. That's the part that bothers me the most. It showed up on a Wednesday night when I was looking for a charger in my bag, one of those distracted, meaningless searches you do when you don't want to think about anything important. My fingers brushed against something thicker than paper. I pulled it out and frowned. A notebook. Black cover. Corners bent. My handwriting on the first page. For a moment, I didn't recognize it. Then my chest tightened, slow and deliberate, like my body remembered before my mind did. I hadn't seen this thing in years. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it carefully, like it might fall apart if I moved too fast. The pages were filled with ideas. Sketches. Half-written plans. Notes scribbled in margins during lunch breaks and late nights. This wasn't nostalgia. This was evidence. Evidence of a version of me that once wanted something badly enough to write it down. I flipped through the pages, each one pulling me backward. Back to late nights fueled by ambition instead of obligation. Back to the quiet belief that I could build something that was mine. I remembered how alive I felt then. Not confident. Not fearless. Just awake. I closed the notebook and laughed under my breath. A short, humorless sound. I knew exactly when I stopped working on this. It wasn't after the wedding. It wasn't even after the promotion that came with longer hours and better pay. It was after the conversation. We were standing in the kitchen of the old apartment, the one with the crooked cabinet doors and the window that never quite closed. I'd been talking too fast, words tumbling over each other, excitement bleeding through every sentence. She listened quietly. Then she said it. "Why are you so obsessed with this?" I froze. "It's not practical," she continued. "You already have a good job. Why risk everything for something that might not work?" I remember nodding, smiling, telling her she was right. I remember saying I could always come back to it later. Later turned into never. Back in the present, I ran my thumb along the edge of the notebook. The anger I expected didn't come. No rage. No bitterness. Just a dull, sinking awareness. The resentment I carried through the marriage, the quiet frustration, the impatience, the sense of being unseen, it didn't start with her. It started with me. I had made a deal I never admitted to making. I traded hunger for stability, risk for approval, purpose for peace. And then I blamed her when the cost showed up years later. The realization hit me harder than the divorce papers ever did. I wasn't just grieving the end of a marriage. I was mourning the man I slowly talked myself out of being. I stood up and paced the room. The walls felt closer than usual, like they were listening. Every excuse I'd ever used started lining up in my head. It was the responsible choice. I was doing it for us. Timing just wasn't right. They all sounded thin now. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A notification from work. Something about deadlines. Performance. Expectations. I ignored it. For the first time in weeks, something else mattered more. I sat back down and opened the notebook again. This time, I didn't skim. I read. Some of the ideas were bad. Naive. Unrealistic. But some of them weren't. Some of them still made my pulse pick up just a little. That scared me. Because excitement comes with a price when you're pushing 40. It demands energy you're not sure you still have. It forces you to admit that safety might be the bigger risk. A voice in my head tried to shut it down. "You're too old to start over. You already failed once. Don't embarrass yourself. I closed the notebook again, hands shaking slightly. The easiest thing would have been to put it back in the bag. Forget it existed. Tell myself that chapter of my life was over. Almost did. Instead, I placed it on the desk. Not as a promise. As a question. Could I still choose something difficult, without asking permission? I didn't have the answer yet. Only the discomfort of realizing how long it had been since I'd even asked. As I turned off the light and lay back on the bed, one truth stayed with me. The divorce didn't take my future. I had given it up long before the marriage ever ended. And now that I could finally see that clearly, there was no unseeing it. It wasn't a single moment that broke me. It was a collection of small, unremarkable failures piling up until I could no longer ignore the weight of them. Monday started like any other. The cheap coffee burned my tongue, and the office lights buzzed overhead, flickering in a way that felt almost personal. I had volunteered for a new project, a desperate attempt to prove I still had value, but within hours it became painfully clear that I'd overestimated my own ability to perform under pressure. Details slipped. Deadlines loomed. Emails I meant to answer got lost in the fog of my distracted mind. By the afternoon, the first reprimand came. Not dramatic. No yelling. Just a quiet email from my boss, letting me know my performance wasn't acceptable. I read it at my desk, the words seeping through me like water through a cracked dam. Not anger, not shame exactly. Just the hollow ache of being inadequate. I went to the restroom and stared at myself in the mirror. Same tired eyes. Same pallor. Same man who had always adapted, always survived. And now, I wondered if survival was enough. By evening, I was alone in the apartment that wasn't mine. The walls closed in. The silence pressed. I poured whiskey into a glass, fingers trembling, and I drank not for taste, but for the illusion of warmth. Each sip was a reminder that no one was coming to save me. I thought of calling a friend, someone who might offer advice or a shoulder. But the truth was, I had been disappearing for years. Too busy conforming to everyone else's expectations to ever be honest with anyone, including myself. And then the phone buzzed. A message from someone I hadn't expected. A colleague I respected, someone I thought had noticed more than they had. Just a few words. You've been disappearing for years. It wasn't judgment. It was observation. And it hurt worse than the divorce ever had. I went to bed that night not angry. Not defeated. Just quiet. And in that quiet, I began to see the truth clearly. I had avoided confrontation, risk, and disappointment for so long that I didn't know how to stand up even when the world demanded it. Sleep came fitfully, riddled with half-formed dreams of opportunities missed and words left unsaid. I woke to the same ceiling, the same thin mattress, the same fan that never quite spun straight. And I realized that my life had been moving without me, quietly, while I tried to maintain the illusion of control. Work the next day was worse. Another email, another failure. I started to avoid conversations, dodge phone calls, hide behind the thin veneer of normalcy. Each interaction reminded me that I was losing, quietly and irrevocably. Not because the world was against me, but because I had stopped standing up for myself. I stopped going out. Restaurants, bars, social events, they all felt like reminders of a life I had failed to protect. My ex-wife's absence, once a wound, now felt like a mirror reflecting the choices I had made. Not her choices. The turning point wasn't an epiphany. It was noticing the absence of anyone noticing me. Not my father. Not my friends. Not colleagues. Just me. And the realization was chilling. I couldn't rely on anyone to validate my existence. That night, the apartment was cold. I pulled a blanket around my shoulders and sat in silence. I thought about quitting everything. My job, my responsibilities, my attempt to rebuild. It would have been easy. Easier than facing the truth. Easier than admitting that I had to start somewhere unfamiliar, uncomfortable, alone. And yet, even in that pit of despair, a faint flicker remained. A question. A challenge. Could I rise even if no one was there to catch me? Could I rebuild a life without the scaffolding I had once leaned on? The answer wasn't immediate. There was no sudden clarity. Only the quiet understanding that hitting bottom meant something essential. I could no longer hide behind avoidance. I could no longer pretend that survival without intention was enough. In that quiet night, alone with my failures, I began to see the outline of a path forward, not safe, not certain, but undeniably mine. It was uncomfortable, frightening, and utterly necessary. And somewhere in that discomfort, the first real spark of possibility glimmered. The morning light seeped through the blinds in thin, sharp lines across the floor. I lay in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the man I had become. Not the man I wanted to be. Not the man I once dreamed I could be. Just this version, frayed and hollowed out, surviving rather than living. For years, I'd blamed others for what had gone wrong. My ex-wife. Circumstances. Timing. But in the quiet of this new morning, something hit me. The problem wasn't what had been taken. It was what I had handed over willingly, piece by piece. I got out of bed and walked to the desk, the black notebook from years ago sitting there like a silent witness. I opened it and read again. The ideas I had abandoned, the plans I had set aside, the risks I had decided weren't worth taking. I had traded my own ambition for comfort, approval, and a sense of being dependable. I realized, painfully, that the resentment I carried wasn't about loss. It was about neglecting myself. I took a deep breath and sat down. Not to dwell. Not to mourn. But to acknowledge. To own. I had to face the uncomfortable truth. I was complicit in my own erasure. I had built walls for stability, avoided confrontation, and prioritized comfort over growth. And now, if I wanted to change, I had to confront every small, quiet compromise I had ever made. It was uncomfortable. Brutally so. The realization that I had given up so much, voluntarily, stung more than any divorce settlement. No one had taken my life. I had handed it over willingly. And in that acknowledgement lay the first flicker of power. I started small. Tasks I had been avoiding. Calls to people I had neglected. Emails that required effort, thought, and honesty. It was painstaking. I stumbled. I forgot things. I felt weak. But for the first time in months, there was movement. There was action. Not survival. Not numbness. Work became a proving ground. I re-engaged with colleagues, not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to myself. Mistakes happened, as they always do, but I owned them instead of hiding. Each acknowledgement, each decision, each deliberate act of participation felt like pulling myself out of quicksand. I was still me. Flawed, uncertain human, but me. Even relationships started to feel different. I reached out to my father, not for validation, not to apologize for being distant, but to re-establish connection on honest terms. I told him what had been happening, not hiding behind excuses or defenses. It was uncomfortable, but it was real. And the relief that followed was profound. The silence that had haunted me for weeks was broken by conversation that mattered. At night, I began keeping a journal again. Not the old notebook, but a new one, lines unwritten and waiting. I wrote about small victories, thoughts I had avoided, and intentions I wanted to act upon. It was deliberate, controlled, quietly empowering. Each word was a reclaiming of something I had allowed to be lost. The internal dialogue changed too. Where there had been blame and self-recrimination, there was now acknowledgement and determination. I reminded myself, no one took my life. I handed it over. And I could choose to take it back, piece by piece. I didn't have a roadmap. I didn't have guarantees. I only had the commitment to act intentionally, to face discomfort without fleeing, to rebuild not because someone expected me to, but because I finally wanted to. It was the first time in years that I felt the quiet thrill of self-responsibility. Not pride. Not arrogance. Just the subtle, steady strength of someone who has looked at their own failures and decided to do better. Not for anyone else, but for himself. By the end of the week, the apartment felt slightly less alien. The days had shape again, not because structure had been imposed from the outside, but because I had chosen to create it. I wasn't healed. I wasn't complete. But I was moving. And that was enough for now. As I lay in bed that night, the quiet clarity settled in. The divorce had stripped away comfort and illusion, yes. But the real work, my own reclamation, was just beginning. And for the first time, I felt ready to do it on my own terms. It hit me on a Thursday morning, unannounced, while I was making coffee. A single opportunity that could either redeem everything I had abandoned or confirm that I was too far gone to matter. The email had arrived overnight. A project I had once dreamed of, a chance to work in a role that demanded ambition, creativity, and courage. It was risky. It required leaving behind the comfort I had painstakingly rebuilt, exposing myself to scrutiny, potential failure, and the judgment of everyone I thought I had impressed or disappointed over the years. I sat at the edge of the counter, coffee untouched, staring at the screen. Fear and exhilaration collided. My chest tightened. Thoughts raced faster than I could track. Could I really do this? Could I put myself in a position to fail publicly after all the quiet defeats I'd endured? The easy answer was no. The safe answer was no. But deep down, the honest answer was, I didn't want easy anymore. Not if it meant trading numbness for life. I thought about my father. His voice, steady but firm, echoing from the past, just don't disappear again. Not as a threat, but as guidance. A reminder that life was finite, and opportunities didn't wait for the timid. I thought about my ex-wife, about the marriage, the compromises, the years spent shelving ambition for acceptance. It wasn't anger I felt. Not yet. Just the quiet, powerful realization that the life I wanted wasn't anyone else's to grant. And it wasn't going to be given to me by staying safe. I made the first move. I replied to the email, not with hesitation or overthinking, but with decisive intent. I would take the risk. I would expose myself to discomfort, judgment, and the possibility of failure. Because if I didn't, I knew I would regret it more than any setback could ever hurt. The hours that followed were a blur of preparation, research, and planning. Every action felt heavier, charged with significance. I was conscious of every decision, every choice of words, every potential mistake. It was exhausting, but it also felt alive. I had not felt this awake in years. By evening, the choice was made concrete. My calendar filled with interviews, meetings, and preparatory work. I could not back out now without admitting to myself that fear still controlled me. I called my father that night. The conversation was cautious at first, then open. I shared the opportunity, my apprehension, and my resolve. His response was simple, but it resonated. Then go. Fail if you have to, but don't disappear. The words were both warning and permission. I hung up feeling lighter, more determined. As I prepared for bed, my mind raced with possibilities. I envisioned failure, yes, but also success, the first real success I could claim without it being filtered through the expectations of others. The idea terrified me, and that terror, strangely, became the fuel I needed. Lying in the dark, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about career or ambition. It was about reclaiming the part of me I had abandoned, the part that once dreamed, hoped, and acted without seeking permission. Fear would always be present. But now I had chosen to act anyway. And in that act, however small in the grand scheme, I began to understand something profound. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to move forward despite it. The turning point wasn't marked by fanfare or applause. There were no witnesses, no dramatic declaration. Just me, alone in a room, feeling the familiar weight of apprehension and the unfamiliar thrill of possibility. I had made my choice. And for the first time in years, it felt like I was truly living. I didn't expect to see her. Not today. Not here. The encounter was accidental, almost cruel in its timing. She appeared in the lobby of the building where I had just started this new project, her presence immediately pulling all the old memories into the sharp present. The woman who had once been the center of my world, now a stranger with a familiar face. My first instinct was to turn and walk away. But something inside me held. Something quieter, steadier than the old insecurities and resentments. I stayed. She smiled faintly, the kind of polite acknowledgement that felt both civil and distant. There was no anger, no accusation, just a reflection of time past and choices made. "Hi," she said, soft, measured. "Hi," I replied, voice calm. Not rehearsed. not tense. Just calm. There was a pause, pregnant with years of unspoken words. I realized then that I didn't feel the old weight. No longing. No bitterness. Just clarity. The clarity that comes from realizing the past didn't take what mattered most. It only removed the illusion. I heard about the new project, she said. Seems like you're moving on. I nodded. I am. I finally understand what I want. And it's not permission. Her expression softened, a flicker of recognition and perhaps surprise. She didn't challenge me. She didn't apologize. And in that absence of confrontation, I understood that none of this had ever been about her control. It had been about mine. We spoke briefly, words careful but honest. I didn't recount my failures. I didn't expect validation. I simply acknowledged the distance and the growth that had happened quietly, unseen, over years of solitude and self-reflection. Walking away from her, I felt a lightness I hadn't known for years. The past was no longer a chain. It was a mirror reflecting lessons learned, resilience earned, and autonomy reclaimed. Later, in the quiet of my apartment, I reflected on the encounter. It had been more than a meeting. It was confirmation that I could confront history without being consumed by it. That the choices I had made, difficult and often lonely, were mine to own. No one had taken my future. No one had defined my worth. I had done the work of understanding, of rebuilding, and in doing so, I had faced the past without fear. For the first time, I realized that emotional maturity wasn't about reconciliation or approval. It was about knowing who you are, standing by it, and refusing to let the ghosts of old mistakes dictate the life you still had the power to live. I poured a glass of water, sat by the window, and looked at the city lights. They seemed sharper tonight, edges defined, clarity piercing the usual haze. The encounter had left me calm, grounded, and self-defined. I whispered to myself, quietly, almost as a mantra, I finally know what I want. And it's not permission. And in that moment, I understood that the past no longer held sway over me. I had faced it, accepted it, and now I could move forward fully, intentionally, and freely. Morning comes differently now. The light isn't harsh. The apartment feels lived in, not temporary. My coffee is warm in my hands, not out of necessity but because I choose to savor it. The days have rhythm again, but it's a rhythm I've built, not one imposed by others. This is intentional living. I still stumble sometimes. The past doesn't vanish. Old fears, doubts, and memories whisper from the corners of the mind. But I acknowledge them without surrendering. They are shadows, not chains. Work is still a challenge. Mistakes happen, deadlines loom, and stress finds its way in. But I face it differently now. I am active, engaged, and responsible, not for approval, not to survive, but because I am committed to being the best version of myself. The joy isn't in perfection. It's in showing up fully, every day. Relationships are evolving too. I reconnect where it matters. Family, friends, colleagues. I communicate honestly, setting boundaries, expressing needs, and listening without defensiveness. I am present, not performative. Connection feels earned and real, and the satisfaction of it is subtle but profound. In quiet moments, I reflect on what has truly been taken. The home, the routine, the illusions of safety and certainty, all gone. And yet, the essence of me remains. The spark that was buried under expectation, compromise, and avoidance flickers again, steady and strong. The man I am becoming isn't defined by loss. He is defined by the choices he makes now, consciously and deliberately. I think about her sometimes, not with longing, not with anger, but as a part of the journey that forced me to wake up. The divorce didn't destroy me. It revealed what was never truly mine to give away. The life I thought I had lost was built on approval, not authenticity. And authenticity, I finally understand, cannot be taken. I have routines now, small and meaningful. Exercise, writing, reflection, work that challenges me, and moments of quiet observation. I plan, but I remain flexible. I take calculated risks, embrace discomfort, and trust the process without needing external validation. Most nights, I sit by the window, city lights twinkling like distant stars. I breathe deeply, feeling the pulse of life that I have claimed for myself. The freedom is subtle, not flashy. It doesn't roar, it whispers, steady and undeniable. I am here. I am alive. I am intentional. The transformation isn't complete. I will stumble, doubt, and struggle. That's the nature of life. But the difference now is that I understand my role in it. I have ownership. I have agency. And the quiet satisfaction of that knowledge is more enduring than any external success could ever be. As I prepare for sleep, I reflect one last time on the journey, the loss, the regret, the confrontation, and the reclamation. And I smile softly. She took everything that wasn't mine to begin with. And now I keep what is truly mine.